Welcome to Grounded Not Divided, a podcast about leaders who are getting important things done in the real world. I'm Matt Burgess. My guests on this show all have hard-won real-world experiences that shed light rather than heat on society's most vital issues. Today's guests are Dave and Bob Lawrence, and we bring you a conversation we recorded live in November at the University of Wyoming. Energy security and environmental protection are popular American priorities that often get chopped up into simplified sound bites in our polarizing political discourse. What does progress on these issues actually look like on the ground? How can businesses, policymakers, and academics work better together to develop and advance solutions? I discuss these questions and more with Dave and Bob Lawrence, who are identical twins and industry leaders who each have 40 years of experience. They have worked in industries ranging from carbon sequestration, oil and gas, the Environmental Protection Agency, and big law. They currently lead the nature-based environmental solutions company Land and Carbon Inc., which sequesters carbon by restoring soils on degraded lands. On energy and climate, it's really hard to find two people who are more surrounding the issue in terms of their 40-year career than these two guys. They've worked in big oil, in big law, in environmental law, in carbon sequestration, in academia, in industry. I could go on. You get the point. And so I'm really excited to talk to these two about their careers, how they got to where they are, because I think that's really interesting and inspiring for you all. And then towards the end, I want to get into asking them some tough questions about what is going on in energy and environment, and where is it going to head, and what does the election mean for that, and many other things. So maybe just to start, we're passing the mic around. I'll pass it this way. If each of you can give a short summary of how you got to where you are, and feel free to highlight decision points that were unexpected, right turns, left turns, so that our students can empathize with the thought process of how somebody builds a successful career.
Thanks, Matt. First, thanks for having us. We got to talk. I know Matt through his identical twin brother. That's why I got to where I am sitting here right now. So great to be here. My route to where I am is kind of circuitous, but it's I always wanted to make a difference in whatever I did. And, you go through these employment questions at the end of every year. What do you want to do in the next 5 years? And my answer was always the same. I wanted to make a difference. And so I actually started in academia. I taught at a junior college. I'm a geologist, scientist by background. And I taught there 2 years. And then I decided, I wanted to see some application of that. So I went to work in what was the uranium business in southwest Colorado. And I worked in that until 3 Mile Island hit. And so I've seen an industry come and go. And so then I decided that, I'm going to go to graduate school because I thought I wanted to be in academia. And I ended up working for the U.S. Geological Survey and that's when I worked in Wyoming and fell in love with Wyoming and worked in the Kemmer area for the USGS. And I did that for 4 years and lived in Kemmer for a big chunk of that time. I got my PhD, and then I had a major decision to make as to whether I wanted to go into academia or into industry. And at that point in time, I actually interviewed for a job here at the University of Wyoming. Now, I'm not going to tell you what the result of that interview was, but I ended up going into industry and worked with Shell in their research lab. And I was able to work on problems that were not easy to solve, and for which I was told that there were many things were impossible. You won't be able to do this. You'll never be able to do that. There will never be this here. And so I learned at that point in time that I thought it would be important to try to say, how can I solve problems? and what are different ways we might come up with solutions. And was able to do some things that ended up scaling into very large businesses from things that had thought to be originally not possible. And so that was encouraging to me. At a certain point in time, I decided, well, I like the business side of all of this, working with Shell, that I'm going to go into business. And I started a producer financing business on the finance and capital side because we didn't have one. And I saw that as an opportunity and that could help smaller producers move forward. I then moved completely into starting new plays and new opportunities and then scaling them to what would be global scale. And I took a lot of joy in taking new technologies, new ideas, new models, and saying, how can you transition these from the lab, from research into practical application and do it at scale? And that resulted in a number of different new plays around the world. Finally, with my career with Shell, I was able to work in renewables and see how difficult it is to make a renewables business work. I ran the wind business. And many lessons from that on the essentials of fundamental business operations and execution to make a renewables business successful. I retired from Shell in 2013, and I've been heavily involved in carbon, looking at different ways to handle CO2 emissions and to reduce those, but always working on the emissions side of the equation. And I focused on how can we do that? How can you turn that big ship? And I'm sure we'll talk more about that. I won't go into that right now. But at a certain point in time, I was giving a talk and on what could we do to reduce carbon emissions. And I outlined the challenges, but I thought we could do it by making them affordable and available and resilient and so forth. And I got to the end of this talk and somebody said, you know, even if we do all of this with this carbon emissions, we're still not going to meet many of our targets for climate change. He said, I think you need to work on the other side of the equation. And I said, well, thank you. And he said, I think you should look at carbon dioxide removal and look at it with plants. So I said, okay, that's interesting. I didn't know anything about it. And this is one of the, I think it's good to jump into things that you don't know anything about sometimes and try to learn as much as you can. So he was working with a place called the Salk Institute, which is a research institute mainly in the medical fields, but also in plant biology. And they were using the power of photosynthesis to take energy from the sun, convert it into organic material. The organic material goes into the soil, and it sequesters carbon in the soil, and looked at different plant traits. And I became fascinated with that. And I thought, okay, there's a solution that could be low cost and could be massively scaled, and that might be able to do something that might make a difference. So I became executive director of the Harnessing Plants Initiative, working with some of my favorite people in the world, some brilliant scientists, which I really loved. And I just take an opportunity, if I could. One of the founders of that, Joanne Corey, passed away last week. She's a brilliant scientist. I just pay homage to her. She's a remarkable person. I left the Salk Institute after helping them spin off the company, and I recognized that there weren't singular solutions that could withdraw the most carbon from the atmosphere and help climate change. And so I said, well, I'm going to look at combining solutions and new and innovative solutions combined with tried and true and tested solutions to get as much carbon as possible into the soil and out of the atmosphere. So I formed Land and Carbon, and we'll talk more about that. But that's the path. I'm a scientist by background. I love business. I've always had a passion for what I do, and I try to keep learning things every day, and hopefully still am.
I'm Bob, not Dave. And thanks, man. Really appreciate it. And on the learning things every day, just talking with people this morning, it's been tremendous. Just for me in learning different approaches, what other people are doing. One of the wonderful things about what I call carbon world is there's always more to learn. It's new. Even though, it's been around, people have heard about it, people have talked about it, but it's new and evolving. The framework is evolving, how it can be most efficient, business within it, and it just fascinates me. And those kinds of things always have. I did not start out thinking, how can I make a difference? I wanted to get through college. I tried to be a geology major like Dave. Dave was very good at it. I did not give it the necessary attention that it deserved. And I became an English major. And I went through, and then I did what people back in those days did. I slowly traveled down to Central America and Guatemala and lived on beaches and that type of thing. I was not making a difference. And I wasn't thinking about making a difference. I was thinking, I'm living my life today. And I enjoyed the hell out of it. It was tremendous. And so I had about 3 years of that kind of a life. And one thing I always had been interested in was environmental issues. On Earth Day in 1970, I put on a black armband. I was in high school, and we took over the high school administration office. I thought I was radical. People were doing that type of thing in those days, and I think there were consequences. Dave probably remembers. I don't. But I'd always been passionate about environmental issues. Dave and I grew up in Illinois, near Lake Michigan, and Lake Michigan was having these huge die-offs of alewives, fish, due in large part to water quality and populations, and I think that impacted me. In any case, when I got back from my Guatemalan adventures, I was married at the time, and my wife decided that she was going to get a PhD in biochemistry at a university whose name, it's south of here. Yeah, where I came from. And I thought, because I was still not thinking that much, I think I'll go to law school. And I applied to law school, got in, didn't really know what I was going to do with my law school education or where I wanted to focus. And it happened that the place I went, University of Colorado, had a good environmental law program and a good natural resources program. And they actually had some clinics that had practical application of environmental law and natural resources law. And I took those, and I loved them. And then I worked quite a bit when I was in law school. I had an internship at the Environmental Defense Fund, because you can see sort of where, that's where I was in those days. And that was fantastic. I learned a huge amount. I think I worked more than I went to law school. And I had a great mentor there. And I thought, all right, this is good, but this is hard. This is hard. There's a lot. I need to be on top of it. And I wasn't particularly used to being on top of it. And I was talking to my mentor, and he asked, are you passionate about this? And I said, yeah, I'm passionate about this. And he said, then, he said, do what you need to do. and I stayed in law school, ended up thriving in environmental and natural resources, and maybe not so much in some of the other courses, but in courses that made a difference. And I ended up graduating from law school, going, working for a judge for a little while, and then fortunately getting a job at the US EPA down in Denver as an assistant regional counsel. And I was the first lawyer that was hired in Region 8 for the new Superfund program. And that, sometimes I compare that experience to this experience. Everything was new. There weren't all the guidance and the regulations, and there was an opportunity to shape how things would happen. And I guess that's making a difference. And I did that for a number of years. And I moved through, but then I went into private practice. I always had been entrepreneurial, usually on small scales, lawn mowing businesses, painting. Dave was the expert painter. But I always liked that. And I moved to a small law firm, an environmental natural resources firm that we grew from 8 lawyers to 100 lawyers over about a period of 10 years. And one of the lessons within that was, depending on which is the scaling of a business, the scaling of a culture of a business, how that works, whether it's important. That firm blew up. I thought it was a disaster at the time. It turned out to be just a blessing because then I could move on to something else. And then I worked in big law. And all of this time, I was working on all aspects of environmental issues: water, air, obviously the Superfund, land, surface contamination, underground injection. We were talking about that a little bit earlier today, the gamut. And then in addition to that, I became deeply involved in natural resource damages issues, which have a significant component of economics. And that was tremendous. Learned a lot about that. And litigation. You probably look at me, or at least I look at myself and think, you do not look like you do litigation. You do not look like a litigation attorney. You are not a mad dog pit bull. And I'm not. But it took me about 13 years to realize that. That was something I was good at. It was not something I was passionate about. I like solutions. Like Dave said, I like solutions. I like bringing people together, coming up with something that works, solving problems. And litigation was when all of that hasn't worked. So ultimately, I retired from that and was alluded to, moved up to the mountains in Colorado near Vail. I retired, interestingly, around the same time, probably the same date that Dave did, totally without knowledge, a twin thing. And I moved up to the mountains, and I became a full-time ski instructor, which I still love and which I still do. But I kept an interest in environmental issues. I kept an interest in climate. I was by no means an expert. Dave was doing all of this work on the energy transition, and as he started to do his work within SALC, I became more and more interested in that. When Dave came up with the idea conceptually of land and carbon, degraded lands, putting these different kinds of solutions together, and then potentially withdrawing gigatons of carbon over this massively available landscape across the planet of degraded lands, I became very interested. So after we formed the company, I thought, well, that's great. I've just helped somebody else form a company. I'll just keep ski instructing. And Dave asked me to join him, which I was thrilled about because it combined all of my interests. But I have this really good friend, Jamie, and he said, why are you doing this? You're enjoying your life. You're loving your life. And I was. And why would you do this? It doesn't make sense. And I said, well, Dave asked me. I'm going to do it. And it happened to match everything that I like. So that's how I got to where I am. I don't know how much conscious effort there was in being where I am.
I think both of those stories illustrate for you students in the audience how the mantra that success is when opportunity meets preparation. And just thinking about how, you don't know what doors are going to open, but you do have control over the training and experience that you get. Okay, shifting gears, I want to talk about your company, Land and Carbon, Inc., but I want to do so in the context of the big challenge of carbon sequestration. So if you take the IPCC's models that have us meeting the 2-degree target, or the 1.5 degree target, if that's even possible, which many people think it isn't, you're talking about tens of gigatons of carbon sequestration. And people talk about direct air capture and point source capture and different types of storage. And so I'd love to get your perspective. I'm going to maybe ask Dave about the science and then Bob about the policy. I'd love to get your sense of what do you think the outlook is for this industry in, say, the next 20 to 30 years when these scenarios assume that it needs to scale to this level, tens of gigatons, can it be done? And from a business perspective and a science perspective, how did you guys land on degraded lands as your solution space?
I might start with the second, and then I'll get into how that fits into the context. If you drive across the state of Wyoming and drive from here to Rock Springs and look out the window and just look at the landscape that you come across, and you'll see land that has a lot of barren ground, a lot of land that's been heavily grazed. You'll see a lot of land that is just barren. You'll see land that's been damaged by heavy machinery. You'll see land that's in and around infrastructure, pipelines, rigs, etc., highway bypass. You'll see degraded land everywhere. Fly over the country, and you'll see degraded land everywhere. If you look at degraded land, you'll think, okay, is this land being used for its best and highest purpose? What could this land do? And there is a beauty in, and really a transformative value in highly degraded, ugly land that can be remarkable. And it turns out that degraded land is one of the best places that you can capture CO2 in soil. It's got a tremendous capacity to absorb carbon. It can accrue it at a faster rate. It's also land that has a very low value, so you can access it at a low cost. It's land that's not being used typically. So if you want to do something with that land, you're not displacing something else that sits on that land. And you can do a lot with it. What can you do with degraded land? You can grow things on it. That's good. You can do that, and that can improve food security. You can restore the soil health. You can restore the soil structure. That's good. That can help you with things like water retention in the soil and water runoff. As you restore things, you can increase biodiversity that exists on the land. And as you put organic matter into that land via planting plants, or soil amendments that you use, you can store a lot of carbon in that land. And so then you take a land that has been not highly valued and you can make it productive, you can make it have a higher yield, you can make it have higher biodiversity, help enhance food security, you can help manage water, and you can store carbon. But it turns out that there's a lot of degraded land. There's more than 1 billion acres of degraded land in North America and South America alone. That sits not only in ranchlands and grasslands, but it's been by overgrazing, poor crop management, and so forth, but also in manufacturing infrastructure land. So if you take that degraded land and you just put a small amount of carbon into that land, and you do that over a lot of acreage, you can get to massive scale in taking carbon out of the atmosphere using the power of plants, power of organic material, and land management. So I thought, okay, let's use degraded land that's not being used, that's underutilized, undervalued, and transform that land into something very significant. And I recognize that there was no one single bullet to do that. It's not just anything, it's not just putting biochar in that land, it's not just using, say, rotational grazing, it's not just grasslands, it's not just enhanced rock weathering, it's many different other applications. But if you combine these and then you tailor those solutions to the land that you found, you could really optimize the amount of carbon that you could put into that soil. And in doing that, versus any singular solution, you could get 2 times or more carbon in any given acre. And by putting 2 times or more carbon in that soil while doing all these other good things that I talked about, that creates a real value proposition. That creates real value for that land. That creates real value for the planet. So I thought I'm going to start a company to be able to do that. And I'm a scientist. We're deeply founded in science. We're a science-driven company, and we deploy multiple combinatory solutions then to get the most carbon into the land and take the most amount of CO2 out of the atmosphere. So what do you do with that carbon? And this gets into the question, what happens in this world that we live in today? Well, we know that if you look at many of the different IPCC scenarios, from whatever business as usual to an aggressive scenario, it's not that even if you're in a very aggressive emissions reduction scenario, you still end up with a small but gigatons scale amount of carbon that you need to withdraw from the atmosphere. If it's business as usual, it's 5 to 10 gigatons a year to get to carbon neutrality. So to address climate change, we need to take a lot of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, gigatons of carbon dioxide. So that's what our mission is to take gigatons of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. But what happens in today's world? What's going to happen to this carbon market? Are we going to be able to do that? Well, we know that, and I don't know if this is where you want to go with this.
Let me just back up a little bit. So you're creating value for many of your customers on their land, irrespective of the carbon that you're sequestering. But you're also sequestering carbon. For those who are not steeped in this world, who's the buyer for that?
So there are 2 ways you can sell carbon. You can go into a compliance market and have a carbon price that you're able to obtain, or the major market for these offsets right now is in something called the voluntary carbon market. And that's major corporations with major customers who buy products from everywhere. And thousands of corporations around the world have dedicated themselves to a net zero target. They can get a substantial way to their net zero target of carbon emissions towards carbon emissions by the actual emissions reduction that they make in their own operations, in the operations of their suppliers, and ultimately in the operations of people who use their products. But to get the rest of the way, they want to buy carbon credits or carbon offsets. And so they are your customers. And they're committed to net zero targets. Many of them are global businesses. Their customers want them to be conscious of their emissions. Customers want them to reduce CO2. So they're the buyers of your carbon credits.
Thank you. That's a great segue to the policy question, Bob. So you have these voluntary buyers who are buying credits. You have also what you call compliance market. Basically, either the government is buying or the government is forcing somebody to buy. In the United States, we have a federal government carbon market called 45Q. Can you tell me, in terms of policy, how do these different markets compare in sizes? And to what extent, if at all, does policy uncertainty in, say, the federal government's approach to carbon capture affect the outlook of your business?
Fortunately for us, how the federal government looks at nature-based solution carbon capture in the voluntary carbon market doesn't affect our business that much. It might. I was talking earlier today with someone. Will the change in administration, will that affect what we do? And there's views all over the map on that. Could be it's to our benefit. There will be more need for carbon offsets in the voluntary carbon market because there may be more emissions because they'll be less regulated. But the companies will still want to meet their net zero goals. It could be somewhat squashed. I think that's unlikely because the voluntary carbon market is global. It is not, and it has governing bodies all the way down from the UN to various certification programs, international programs, carbon crediting programs. But the voluntary carbon market is voluntary. It's not mandatory. And these programs are not regulated by the government. So within the U.S., there is not an overriding structure of laws or regulations for the voluntary carbon market in what we do. Now, you look at some other aspects where there is regulatory structure. When you're looking at carbon capture, utilization, storage options, there's more regulatory oversight and permitting oversight. That market is more controlled, but there's still uncertainty there's still uncertainty that exists within that. How is it going to be able to, who are the purchasers of the credits? How is it going to be able to expand? Will investors be willing to invest in something that is far, far more expensive than something like soil-based carbon sequestration? And that has a longer-term payout. In terms of the size, Matt, and I haven't looked at this in detail, I think I would expect at this point, both are fairly nascent. Dave, you might know the comparison. I think the potential for carbon removal from nature-based solutions, soil carbon sequestration, because of the massive amount of degraded lands and other acreages, is huge, and it's at low cost. I can't speculate as to what I think ultimately there will be from other more technological solutions that are more regulated, but I think that potential exists. And, the interesting question from a policy perspective is what's going to allow for scaling of both of these at the level that's necessary to actually make a meaningful difference in the removal of greenhouse gases and provide solutions for climate change. Is that something that a voluntary carbon market can achieve? Is the drive that the primary driver for many companies is one, many companies want to do the right thing, but they also have a driver behind that is that their customers want them to do the right thing, and they have a reputational reason to do the right thing. Is that going to be enough to drive the voluntary carbon market, or does there need to be more than that? On the more technological end, because many are so expensive, there's been the 45Q. We don't participate in that. We have, and we're actually kind of grateful for that. I think it's essential, at least to get those solutions that can take advantage of the 45Q incentives that exists, because otherwise they'd have a hard time getting off the ground. For us, it's not essential. At one point when I first started, Dave asked me, well, look at all the grants and incentives that might be available in both state and federal programs across the United States for the type of work that we did. And there are some that we could squeeze into. And ultimately, we may, if it makes sense, if it matches with what we do, we might, but it's not grants and incentive driven. It's the space that we're in is really driven by basic business economics, willingness of investors to get involved. So
overall, the market's going to grow, and it's going to grow in a very large size. It's like $20 billion now. It'll be $50 billion by 2030 or higher. And I think that this is going to occur regardless of the administration. The big challenge will be capital availability. We talk more about that.
Yeah, it's a really nice segue into my next question. So I've been asked quite a bit by reporters in the last couple of weeks about, what might the election mean for climate change and energy, and to be honest, I don't know. But it did send me down the rabbit hole of looking up what's happened right in the last three administrations, which included either as president or vice president, both candidates in this election. And greenhouse gas emissions in the United States, on average, declined about linearly at a little bit higher than 1% per year, going back to the Bush Jr. administration. There have been really big differences in the rhetoric among the different parties on climate change and energy. In the last three administrations, including Obama 2, Trump 1, and Biden-Harris, the investment in and capacity in renewables has increased dramatically. Oil and gas have increased while coal has decreased. So it seems like on the one hand, we talk about this issue as though it's the most polarizing thing ever, and our parties swing back and forth in their rhetoric, and yet the facts on the ground seem like they have this pretty steady progression. From your perspective, working in these industries over this period of 15 to 20 years, what's your perspective on what's driving that?
So it's interesting. Back in 2017, I think it was 2017, I gave a talk here, and it was called the World Needs More Energy and Less CO2. The world still needs more energy and less CO2. There's been a consistent reduction in the U.S., driven both by a remarkable increase in renewables, in solar and in wind, as we see, and a reduction in the cost of particularly of solar, but also onshore wind. But at the same time, it's also been caused by a displacement of coal by natural gas. If you look at it kind of from a bipartisan or nonpartisan, I know you had Benji here at one point, and I love the quote, nature nonpartisan. If you look at all of that, you see where is some of the greatest reductions in emissions taking place politically in the U.S. I'm asked all of you, what states are those taking place in?
Texas.
Yeah, Texas, Oklahoma. Many of the red states have the greatest reduction in emissions and the greatest improvement in renewables, the greatest penetration of renewables. So the issue of reducing emissions and the issue of doing good things like creating jobs associated with reducing emissions does not necessarily have to be something that is a polarizing aspect of addressing a need for climate change improvement. I like the idea of I think most people rally around let's improve the environment. Most people will rally around we need energy. I think it's a hard thing to argue against we need energy. But if you can show that you can produce and create jobs and reduce emissions in places that have a widely disparate political leanings, that's something that both parties can get around. If you look at what I do and what we do as a company, nature-based solutions. So I would say this, it's hard to find a downside or argue against improving soil health. Somebody can take that position. Do you want to decrease biodiversity? Take that position. Use more water? Take that position. Increase food yields? It's a hard thing to say that. You want to help farmers? You want to help ranchers? You want to make your land more valuable? That doesn't need to be a Republican or a Democratic position. That could be all of our positions. So I think to the extent that we focus not only on this is a climate change helper, but that this is something that helps our environment, helps our economy, that you can take it out of the kind of the partisan world.
So now let me ask the lawyer about the importance of laws. So one argument for the steadiness of the trends that we've seen over the last 3 to 4 administrations is that a lot of what's going on the ground is now in the marketplace, right? You guys both mentioned how the voluntary carbon market is global. I was on the radio yesterday with Rob Godby, a professor in our department, who was talking about how Wyoming exports 90% or more of its coal, often to states that have regulations that that incentivize us to have carbon capture on our coal. The utilities now, we did a study on average, are more ambitious in terms of decarbonizing than state governments require them to be. So So how much of this is going on? Is the steadiness of what we're seeing a function of the facts on the ground are less controversial than we think, or to what extent is it that the private sector has gotten to a point where it's driving what we see on the ground in a way that is impervious to policymakers, or is it that we can't pass anything in Congress?
In the voluntary carbon market, I might be grateful that we can't pass anything in Congress. I'm not sure I'll stay that way. I think it's a combination. I mean, one of the things that's happened since I became involved in environmental issues back in 1970 when I was in that administration office in my high school. If you look at the amount of emissions reduction that has occurred, or discharge of pollutants into waters that has occurred, or the amount of capture of hazardous waste and secure disposal that has occurred, it's really phenomenal. The degree of change, in the high 90 percentiles for how much change has occurred. And that's occurred as a combination of technological improvement. That also occurred quite a bit in that arena, maybe nearly entirely at first through laws and regulatory controls. And those were necessary. Those came at a time when that didn't exist. So if you had Clean Water Act, discharge permit limitations, that was going to be an automatic improvement. And would that have happened? There wasn't the outside incentive or awareness. There might have been awareness among some, but there wasn't anything that would have driven that, I don't think, other than some form of regulatory control. And the same with air emissions. And so that accomplished a lot. That got us a long way. But now I think, when you talk about this steady line, that is because of things like, for example, natural gas. I mean, had a huge impact, and I'm not sure how that plays into the line that you're talking about, but I think it does. Emissions technology on coal-fired power plants, that plays into it. The companies that are willing to go above and beyond the regulatory limitations, that plays into it. A societal awareness, more and more global, not entirely, that this is something that is beneficial and that we need to do, and that there's impacts if we don't. That plays into it. From a policy perspective, I think, and one of the things that I like about the voluntary carbon market is it's an opportunity for the marketplace to play into it. How much is this worth? What is this worth to us to be able to do this based upon a number of different factors?
One thing is cost. And, I always, you can mandate or try to mandate a lot of stuff, but if it's going to cost more to people, it's going to add to costs that consumers face, they're not going to want to do it. One of the greatest drivers, and it's remarkable, in the implementation and the market penetration of renewables has been the reduction in cost. That's made it cost competitive with other energy forms. That's made it palatable to consumers. The cost reduction in solar is absolutely remarkable. I used to run a wind business. The cost reductions in wind have not been as great as they have been in solar, but as those costs have come down, the market penetration has increased very significantly. Natural gas would not be as low cost as it would, and therefore not displacing as many coal-fired power plants had it not been for the all of the shale revolution and the drilling of shale gas. And that's allowed that cost structure to be very competitive. So in addition to the programs and the awareness and the regulatory requirements, I think cost matters. And if you reduce things in energy and make them cost competitive with other things, that'll reduce emissions.
As I was rambling, I realized I really didn't answer your question, which is, so we have these different administrations, and you have this line. So does it matter that much? And is there really this polarization? And what I would say is, I don't think there's as much polarization as people might think on either side, because as Dave was saying, there's a common interest in most of this. And the reason I started talking about that regulatory necessity back in the 70s is, for that, there might have been a difference, probably was a difference depending on which administration was in effect and how much enforcement existed. And I was part of that for a while. But for where we are right now, and I'll just go to the voluntary carbon market, we were asked, Dave and I were asked, and we'd be talking with different people, maybe investors, maybe potential customers. Well, God, you guys must be concerned. And I have no crystal ball, obviously, but there are so many reasons why the voluntary carbon market will continue to progress, apart from what the position of a particular administration might be on that I'm not that concerned. I think the need for the scaling that can happen within the voluntary carbon market to remove gigatons of carbon will still be there, and there will be the desire of purchasers for that. And in some sectors, there will be an impact on things like carbon capture utilization, or those things under the infrastructure bill that have been substantially subsidized. I expect there's going to be a change in that. What will happen, I think, then, is that efforts that have been put into that, we'll find out, are those economically viable without those kind of incentives? Will those be able to go forward? If they do, excellent. If they don't, it'll shift somewhere else. Because I think overall, the interest is we want to remove societally, is that's the direction we want to go.
Okay, two more questions, and then I want to open it up to the audience for the rest of the time. So the first is, we often frame climate and energy discussions about the future around normative questions. What should policymakers force the path of emissions to be? I want to frame a positive question, kind of a what do you think will happen? And I want to frame it around what you might call the energy transition theory. People like Amory Lovins, the idea that whatever governments do, the improvements in the economics of renewables are so amazing, the improvements in energy efficiency are so amazing and underappreciated that no matter what our government does, we're going to have tons of stranded fossil fuel assets by the middle of the century just because of competition. Then there's what you might call energy addition school of thought. Maybe something more like Chris Wright, who's been nominated recently to be our Secretary of Energy. And that story basically goes, yes, we went from wood to coal to oil and gas, now to renewables. And there's some decline in the older technology as the new one comes in, but there's a lot more of just addition. We need more and more energy to what you were saying, Dave, earlier. And if you think about countries like China trying to get off coal, and we have opportunities to export our gas to offset their coal, what do you expect in the future of energy, say in the next 20 to 30 years in the United States? Do you expect us to see more of an energy transition or more of an energy addition or something in between?
Yeah. I've looked at this question now for probably almost 2 decades. And so one way I phrase the question, okay, so I gave a talk here, as I said, 2017. And what do you think that the fossil fuel contribution to global primary energy consumption was? About what percent of that was supplied by fossil fuels? Yeah. It's depending what source you look at. It's somewhere around 81, 82%. Okay, 2017. I think when I said it in 2014, it was somewhere around 81, 82%. What do you think it is today? I mean, there's been remarkable improvements, remarkable. And cost reduction, efficiencies, new sources. What do you think it is today? It's like 81%. So what this says, and why is it? It's because we've got a growing global population moving from 7, and we're adding about a state of Wyoming every day in global population. Energy demand is increasing. We have things using energy that we didn't think we'd ever have before. Data centers, AI, so forth. We know that as we move to electrification, we're going to be needing more energy for electrification. So global energy demand is increasing. And so what you're talking about is maybe a similar percentage of a larger pie. That's not so good. That causes CO2 to continue to increase. So what's going to happen over the next, say, 10 years and to 2050? You're going to see continual, and I think you're especially going to see it in places like North America and Europe, you're going to see progressive displacement of coal. That's going to continue to happen. And that will happen regardless because of the economics of other energy supplies. You'll see very significant increase, although it's starting to taper off in solar and wind, especially as those economics improve. Natural gas will be displaced to other parts of the world that need them. So you see a significant increase in LNG. The emissions reductions are going to need to come from how rapidly can we move into solar and into things like wind. But there are still large segments outside of, say, electrification, outside of electricity and power generation, that are very difficult to decarbonize. And so what that says is that there will still be a significant energy demand for fossil fuels, whether we like to reduce the emission from fossil fuels as we move into the next decade. When will that be? I don't know. It's flattening. It's getting less. Our energy intensity, the GDP is decreasing, but it's decreasing, but it's going to take a while. That's despite our best efforts. So, we're still going to be needing oil and gas, and in places coal, for a long period of time, despite our best efforts because of the growing energy demand. Do I think that the rate of replacement will accelerate? Yes. Do I think that we'll have different substitutes for materials and things? Yep, I think we will. And I think those still will be taking place, and they will still be having emissions. And what does that mean? To meet our energy targets, again, we're going to need some kind of carbon dioxide removal in addition to removing carbon emissions.
No.
For the podcast audience, Bob says he agrees. Okay, let me ask you the next question first, Bob. And broadly, this is inspired by Konstantin Kizin, who's a podcaster that I did a couple of events with last year. He always ends his podcast with, what's something that we're not thinking about that we should be? So I'm going to ask each of you a different version of it. So Bob, in terms of policy, you got a bunch of economists in the room, so people like to think about carbon taxes, right? That people have been thinking about permitting reform a lot recently in the public discussion about climate, industrial policy, Inflation Reduction Act, et cetera. What is an area of policy related to climate and energy that you don't think we're paying enough attention to?
The first thing that sprung to mind is I don't think we're paying enough attention to constraints that exist that are either within regulatory programs or outside of regulatory programs, constraints that exist that inhibit the existence, growth, or large scaling of carbon sequestration, whether it's technology-based or whether it's nature-based soil solutions. And what I'm saying is that it's critically important for everyone, whether it's the purchaser of the carbon credit or any stakeholder, that when you're issuing a carbon credit, some later time we might talk about whether carbon credits themselves are the right way to go. But if you're issuing a carbon credit, that carbon credit really genuinely, really represents the removal of 1 ton of CO2 equivalent from the atmosphere securely in the ground. Everybody wants that. You don't want a sham carbon credit. In order to achieve that goal, we have programs that are set up either in compliance markets or in voluntary markets that, in the process of making sure you have very high integrity, very high quality carbon credits, which I fully support, we need that. Those have to exist. It's become progressively more difficult for companies, project developers to generate those credits. And it reminds me of, even though this is in the voluntary carbon market sphere specifically, but it reminds me of the increasing, like in the hazardous waste program, it became so regulatory, so hundreds of pages of the Code of Federal Regulations, that to get scaling to occur in a timely manner becomes very difficult. And so from a policy perspective, what I'd like to see are approaches that would allow for different methods of assurance. Could be market-based, where the purchaser is required to do its own due diligence on the credit it's purchasing. Could be a simplified or streamlined or more pragmatic approach to various carbon crediting programs that will be designed to incentivize innovative programs that could grow, but from a policy perspective, something that encourages the development of innovative solutions that ultimately are going to be necessary to capture the amount of carbon we need. And different quantification approaches, different carbon accounting approaches, I think that's something that could be useful. But I think, again, from the policy perspective, it's an area where open-mindedness, expansion of thought, trust, collaboration is going to be essential because, and this is an area where you can get polarization. We need this. If we don't have this, then we are not going to be able to have any assurance that we're actually removing carbon. But from a policy perspective, I think we need to move in that direction. And so I hope that happens.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you a different, Dave, version of this. What aren't we thinking about that we should be? And this relates to all of us in academia. You've been in academia and in the private sector. I started out my career as an ecologist. And in ecology, it's so obvious as to be taken for granted that you should see or study species. So if you study monarch butterflies, even if you're modeling them, you should go look at monarch butterflies, right? I found in the social sciences, it's less often assumed that you should do that. So for all of us academics and students in the room who are trying to understand basically how society, including the private sector and government and their interactions, work in relation to the economy, how do you think we can better expose ourselves to what people like you and what you do, and how can we better understand your world and the insights that come from your world?
I love the question. In Obama's inauguration speech in, I think it was 2009, he said something along the line, I'll paraphrase, here's to the risk takers, the doers, the makers of things. And that's what the country was really built on. It was, and that's what allowed us to make great progress. The people who took those risks, who did things, and who made things and actually implemented things. We have the great advantage in this country. We've got one of the world's best academic systems. We have some of the world's foremost thinkers, and many of them are at the University of Wyoming. But we have great universities, and they have enormously valuable ideas. The biggest challenge is taking those ideas and then bringing them out and taking them and moving them at scale. So I think what is really valuable is to say, okay, we have to increase the collaboration between the people who are having the great ideas in academics and also in industry. There are great ideas in industry. And we need to think, okay, what does it take then to move that, to implement that at scale? And what can you do to make that happen? And one of the things that I think is really going to be important is to actually try taking those ideas and implementing them in the field. And it's messy, and it's hard work, and it takes longer than you think it will. It takes a lot of dollars to do it. It never turns out the way you think that it will. But if you actually get out there and make the effort to see how will these things be implemented, to actually test your ideas, I think it can take some of our best new ideas and bring them out into the field. We have a method that we do that within Land and Carbon. We call them innovation sites. We take new ideas on select areas in a field and big land area that are comparable to like-kind areas. We test new ideas with the purpose of implementing them at scale on like-kind land. I think that's very good. So take your ideas and try to test them in the field. The second thing that I would say, especially I spent a lot of time in academics, is there is no singular solution. We tend to get fixed on just one idea, and then we run with it, and we run with it as hard as we can. Combining solutions, integrating solutions, different ideas together, not only in science and technology, but also in business, can be a very effective way to bring things together and to move things to scale.
Okay, let's take a couple of audience questions. If you want to ask a question, raise your hand. I'm going to repeat your question for the podcast audience, so please make it concise if you can. And if you want to direct it at one or the other of the Lawrences, please say so. Chuck.
So, I think these cards, because the last has and then I could be crazy. But sure. So,
Okay, my attempt at concisely paraphrasing that question is, you talked earlier about how one of the advantages of your approach is that there's so many degraded lands, there's so much scale, but that also means that there's a logistical challenge of doing whatever you're doing across a huge area. How do you do that?
Thanks. I just want to clarify. The question is towards what we're doing versus what's, say, being done with carbon sequestration and storage. Okay, so what we're doing is we're using plants and amendments applied in situ on land. So what do we do? Plants have one of the greatest capabilities to take energy from the sun, convert it into, and take CO2 out of the atmosphere, convert it into different carbon compounds, put them into the soil. When they do that, they're doing that in situ. There is no transport. It's taking what needs to be transported, things like seed. So if you need a large seed bank, you need to do that to be able to plant things like soil amendments if you need to do that. But those are typically not long-distance transport problems. The great advantage of what we're doing with nature-based solutions, and particularly what we're doing with soil carbon sequestration, is that we use the power of plants to take the CO2 out of the atmosphere, put it into roots and shoots. The roots keep the carbon in the ground. The soil stores the carbon. We can go into great technical reasons as to why that is in different compounds, and we don't need a major transportation mechanism. The acreage that you have stores the carbon in the soil. I don't know if that answers your question, but happy to address more.
Yeah, over here.
I'd like to ask about your book regarding the carrying capacity of degraded content.
So the question is, what are you doing in regards to the carrying capacity of degraded lands?
Yeah, so if you look at degraded lands and look at the typical soil organic carbon content and look at them and say, what's a reasonable carbon content? That might be 3%, 4%, or 5%. Many of the lands that we're dealing with have soil organic carbon content of 0.5%, 1%, 1.5%. And so if you look at each, say, 1% increase in soil organic carbon content in the soil, which you can do by combining these different methods, that 1% increase equals about 50 tons of carbon per acre that you have. Now, 50 tons of carbon per acre, that's a lot. But that's 50 tons of carbon. That equals 50 times 3.67, more than 150 tons of CO2 per acre. So if you're sequestering 1 to 2 or more, or 3, or whatever the number happens to be for the type of land that you have a tremendous capacity, just even increasing 1%. And we know that in like-kind soils in these areas, for example, you can have 4% or 5% or even higher soil organic carbon. So you're not approaching that carrying capacity in a 30-year project life.
Yeah, I start from here to Rock Springs.
Yeah.
Down these vast open areas.
Yeah.
You know, and seems wonderful. Yeah. The numbers of arts, but to see what's growing in these mountains and making rates, and may have to go for it as Western.
Yeah, so if it is at its maximum capacity, and that's one of the things that you go and you test and you take the soil samples, and yet we look at a lot more than just soil organic carbon. We look at nutrients and macronutrients, pH, and everything that causes things to be able to grow. But if you go there and it is for that type of soil at a high soil organic carbon content, then it will not be able to absorb as much content. But you'll make a test for that. And what you'll find in a lot of that land is that the soil organic carbon content is far below what it could be in that degraded land.
Finbar.
So I'm curious, you as if you give any agreements to constructors around peak to oil, peak to natural gas, the energy production is dependent on fossil fuel economy, and I'm considering on shale revolution to give people sort of the unrealistic expectation that innovation will continually keep the price of fossil fuels. So that
So the question was, given your background, Dave, in oil and gas, how concerned should we be about the peak oil phenomenon and at some point an end to the ability of innovation to keep prices down?
So you can't just drill. And I think Harold Hamm said yesterday, I think that geology matters. So there will come a time when the production rates from the shale basins will start to decrease. And, you know, let me be very clear about this. I think that as oil demand starts to flatten, as we get an increased penetration of solar and wind, we will still need new oil to replace the natural decline of oil and gas fields, which I think is what you're addressing. So I think that I don't think it's realistic to think in the near term, while we're trying to address the emissions, that we're going to hit a state where the supply of oil that we have, especially with the shale revolution, because it's happened in the U.S., but there are still other places, and there are still maybe new places that can open up with that, that will end up with a very high price and come up to a much higher price of oil. At the same point in time, I don't think that we're going to end up, because of the way the market works, that we're going to end up with a super overabundance of oil right now. Right now, what we're seeing as you look at spare capacity around the world is, again, we're still having a need for increased oil supplies. We haven't talked at all about energy security in this session, but much of that oil goes through very politically volatile areas like the Strait of Hormuz. So it might be subject to things like price spikes and so forth. But I think that just in terms of absolute supply of oil and the demand, I think it'll start to peak somewhere probably in the late 20s, early 30s, start to flatten, and then it'll take longer to decline than we think it will. But just to be clear, you can't drill forever in every basin, everywhere, and expect to still have the same amount of hydrocarbons coming. There will need to be some new supplies to make up for that.
Tara?
You mentioned like patents on looking at the sequestration process, how do you calculate carbon intensity of those products with additives as part of your calculation?
So the question was, how do you calculate the carbon intensity of additives in your soil operation?
The answer is you measure it, and I can let Bob talk about it in terms of the things, but you account for the CO2 emissions and the carbon that you need to put things into the ground. So if you're adding a carbon amendment, imagine you're adding biochar. You account for the biochar carbon. That's not what we get to add. It's subtracted from any carbon accrual. And then what you get is the increase in carbon in the soil in and around that biochar. Same applies to if you're using whatever equipment or machinery or transportation, back to the transportation question, to get things there, you need to account for that carbon that's required to be able to do that in the form of fuels and emission. And it's subtracted.
Yeah, it's a great question. And so within the quantification phase of any kind of a rigorous methodology, whether it's Vera or CAR, ACR, gold standard, other standard, that's taken into consideration, and it needs to be included within your quantification of the net amount of carbon that you're ultimately sequestering, and you have to be able to submit and provide that information in your project plan that ultimately gets verified. And let's just say you disregarded that project plan that would be and how you intend to quantify the amount of carbon that you're capturing would be returned to you, and it would say you're using X, whatever the amendment is, or you're using some type of, let's say it's an organic amendment, and that contains some amount of carbon, but you didn't subtract for that from your net amount of carbon. That would be returned to you. I mean, biochar, Dave, is an interesting thing because there's some extraordinary benefits for purposes of nature-based soil sequestration from biochar. It's also very expensive. So we're looking at possible different ways. But in the production of biochar, there is a process where the biochar producer, if you want to get certified biochar that has, for purposes of certain carbon credits, where the producer of that biochar has to provide an accounting of the amount of emissions from that production, and that has to then go through the supply chain, ultimately to the wholesaler, down to the retailer. When it gets to us, we can't do what Dave is talking about. We can't say, we're going to put this biochar in the ground and we're going to get some carbon credit for it. What we get the credit for is the additional carbon that's created through photosynthesis because of the increased health of the plants from this biochar that is added to the soil.
From the transport challenge, there's not enough biochar available at this point in time to address the needs on hundreds of millions of acres. That's an issue. So the challenge is, you can say that's impossible, that's done, or you can say, okay, well, how could you use biochar more efficiently and still get the soil benefits? So that's one of the kind of things that we try to do. Use less of it, use it more effectively. It's just an example.
We have time for one more question, if there's any burning ones. Yeah, in the back. So the question was, if I want to reduce my carbon footprint, why would I choose, or why should I choose nature-based over something else?
There's a number of reasons, but I think the best reasons are that it's low cost. It's so your carbon, the cost for each one of these to remove 1 ton of carbon of CO2 is between $20 and $30. That might cause you to do that relative to others, and that might be a primary driver. It's highly scalable. You have a lot of acreage available that you can do this on. It provides extensive co-benefits that also create value that we haven't really talked about except in cursory fashion here. So it improves your ability of your land to produce. You have higher yields, better soil structures, improved drainage, better water retention, better biodiversity, and it's a solution that can be applied around the world and transform lands. Yeah.
And so if your question is, okay, I'm out there, I'm a company, or I'm an individual, and I want to offset my own carbon footprint, I've got a choice of carbon credits. I can go onto the market and buy different kinds of carbon credits. Maybe I really like carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And I think, and for me as somebody who wants carbon credits, that the long-term, thousands and thousands and thousands of years permanence of that's the most important factor. And so I'm going to buy that. I can get some assurance for it, but I'm going to have to pay a lot for that carbon credit. Or maybe I'm a person who's interested in what's going to happen within the next 10 years, 15 years, 5 years, while those types of technologies come online, and I want to make a difference, or I want to get towards my net zero goals, what's available and what's very effective and what is not high cost and what's real and can be quantified and will measurably reduce 1 ton of CO2 in the atmosphere, and I can get a real carbon credit. Then I can say, well, I can purchase a carbon credit at X dollars that I know has removed that amount of money. It's removed the same amount of CO2 from the atmosphere. And I know it's going to last at least, let's go sort of minimal, 30 years, but it depends on the depth of the soil. Hundreds of years, thousands of years in certain instances. And I'm going to make that choice because that's what I think is going to have the most immediate effect. And short term, in terms of what's going to be available, because, I'm a fan of carbon capture, utilization, and storage, even though I can't say it. I'm a fan of direct air capture. These things work, but they are developing and they're evolving and they rely on tax credits and governmental incentives. So what can I do right now?
Thank you for listening to this episode of Grounded Not Divided. If you want to hear more episodes like this, be sure to subscribe for free on Apple, Spotify, or on the Guided Civic Revival Substack. You can also email us feedback at matt.burgess@uwyo.edu. See you next time.